we're back. Let's talk about Salesforce flows and triggers, the before side, the after side. What's the difference? Why do we care? When should we use one versus the other? On flows, we actually call these fast field updates versus actions and related records. And we want to talk about why it matters to build things in one way versus the other, why Salesforce cares about this, and why you might actually find some bugs in your processes if you've done any of this wrong. Flows actually has some, I would say, blockers in the way to help you make the right decision. Triggers don't as much, but these are specifically record triggered flows. If you're going to move some of your workflow rules or process builders into flows, you can take advantage of some of the before and after flexibility that record trigger flows offer, more similar to the way Apex triggers work and the flexibility that we have with code using Apex. It is important though to understand the differences between before and after and why we need to use them separately. So today I started with this diagram over here to try to help explain what's going on. First, we need to talk about and understand briefly the two types of transactions. We have synchronous transactions and we have asynchronous transactions. With synchronous transactions, everything happens in one bubble, so to speak. Once it starts, it has to end, everything has to execute within there. If something does fail along the way, the whole transaction potentially will fail. Whereas asynchronous transaction, you can think of them as happening in different bubbles. So I can get one operation started, I can kick off another one asynchronously, meaning nothing from the first transaction is waiting for the second one. They're happening in their own worlds, in their own universes, kind of. Which can lead to something we call a race condition, which we're not going to get into in detail in this video. But they do have a lot of benefits. When we want lots of complicated, heavy stuff to run in the background, for instance, we may want to run things asynchronously. For this video, we're going to focus really on synchronous transactions and why we have to understand the whole scope of a synchronous transaction, the before side and the after side, and why it's important to get those sides right. So I set up a little bit of a scenario here of the case where we're firing off of a change to an account record. So when we're dealing with triggers, whether they're flow triggers or Apex triggers, we're firing off of these different events. And these events are create or insert into the database, update, delete, and undelete. So anytime one of these types of events happens, we can fire triggers off of it that perform other subsequent actions. The other side of it is, of course, the before and the after. So we have before update, after update, before insert, after insert, and so on. With flows, we do call these fast field updates on the before side, and there's a good reason for that. If we're looking at this diagram here, we have this example of a user working with an account, and in this case, the account is called Acme Corp. The user is working on their laptop, they're making modifications to the account, and when they hit save in Salesforce, that is going to push the information back down to the Salesforce servers. It's going to update that account record in your database, and it's really only going in to update that record with some new information. So if we want to change other information along the way, we typically think of these as the fast field updates on the before side. Let's say the account mailing address is updated and you want, say, the shipping address is updated and you want the billing address to match the shipping address. So we create a trigger that automatically copies that information over. So if the user actually goes in and updates that shipping address, they've only actually requested one thing to be changed. Let's say it was the city. They've changed the city, they've filled in the city, we're making a modification to the record, but we also want to make sure that that value is copied into the billing city field. So as this is coming in, we want to make this change before it lands in the database. So our orange box here, this is going to be our access to our record inside the database where the change is going to occur. So we actually have to modify the record here, and then afterwards we can do some more things, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Changes to this record itself we want to do on the before side, and as you can see, it's because we're already accessing this record. We're not pulling it out, making changes, and putting it back, really. The change is incoming on the shipping field. We have a trigger or a flow that says when you see this action, perform this other action, in this case updating the billing city, and then all together, the whole bundle together will land as a change to the database. So you can see it's important to get that in on the before side, because we're making changes to the record that caused the trigger to fire in the first place. The other nice thing about the before side of the trigger is we've already called the update action. The update action was called by the user, in this case, hitting that save button when changing that shipping city. They've hit save, the update's going to happen, we're simply jumping along for the ride, making another change along the way. We actually can change that field in band and not have to make another update call. So if you're used to flows, you see the update records element, and if you're used to triggers, you make the update call on the Apex code, but on the before side of the trigger, you don't have to do that. You can simply take the object, the record as it comes to you, make the change, never call update, because you're really jumping on the this update train that's already going into this record, and that's already going to happen. You're just making inbound changes. So this is one reason why, if you're making changes to the record that was the cause of the trigger, we're always thinking about operating on the before side, and this is also why flows call these fast field updates. I did this one thing to this one field, I want to make updates to some other fields, but we always want to remember that these are fields of the same record that caused the action to happen in the first place. Now, sometimes we want to make changes to other records based on this change. So let's say we wanted to take that change to the shipping city and also modify some other objects. In this case, we'll say it's the contacts underneath that account that also have a city, and we just want to keep those consistent, and we want it to trickle down. Well, in that case, we're now updating these contact records. They are not the record that caused the trigger. The record that caused the trigger to fire was the Acme Corp account record that got changed. So we want to actually call these on the after side of the trigger. And in the flows, we're calling this actions and related records. So related records in this case are the contact records that we want to update. What we might want to do here is call a query, or in a flow, we're doing it like a get records operation to get the contacts that are related to this account, make those changes. We're doing that in a loop, most likely, loop over those contacts, update all of their city fields to match the account one at a time, and then we call update on those. So the update on those is actually creating another scenario just like this, except that each of those contacts is what's getting changed. And they're also going to have a before and an after. So each of those contacts that goes through this process, it's going to have its own little bubble that just looks just like this, except it's actually wrapped in this entire transaction. It's not asynchronous. Even though I use this term, its own bubble, it's actually synchronous with this transaction over here. It doesn't complete, the whole thing doesn't complete. So if anything fails on the before side or the after side, the whole thing fails. That first shipping city that we talked about actually won't even get updated. And that's why I've drawn this red box around the entire thing, because even though we separate into a before and an after, it's still thought of as one single synchronous transaction where anything fails along the way and the whole thing fails. Of course, we can do things like exception handling and failure paths and flows to handle these situations, but those are handled exceptions or handled failures. Any unhandled exceptions will cause the whole transaction to fall apart. So if you're wondering, well, why didn't it just update the account and then fail on the contacts? Well, because it's all synchronous. If we we changed it where we wanted to safeguard part of this operation and make sure we always update the account, and even if the contacts fail, we would probably fire the contact update off in an asynchronous transaction that happens, that's still listening to the same event, but happens really in a separate area. But remember, any contact triggers that you do have will fire as a result of this, and the trigger loop will continue until it's done. And triggers will only go so deep. They will only cause chain reactions so far before Salesforce cuts that off and says, you've gone deep enough. And I believe that number is 14, but I will have to double check it. I'll try to put something in the comments about that one, or maybe a magical word will appear above my head that corrects me. Who knows? I can tell you one of the things that we've seen, some mistakes that we've seen, is people updating the account that fired the trigger in the after section, calling an update on that, and then we see some weird things happen. Sometimes it works, and then we see mysteriously sometimes it might not work. Really what you're doing is you're causing this recursion to potentially occur because this account's being updated. If you also try to update this account again in the after side, you still haven't finished the initial update transaction, yet you're causing this trigger to fire again, but within itself, within the after section of this. So you're causing these kind of nested, recurring, or recursion, or you could think of it almost as like inception of these triggers firing, and the context under which it's firing becomes less and less predictable. Does this one over here know about the initial changes that came in or not? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. There's a lot of contextual things that become very uncertain here. So never do your field update of that same record in the after side. You'll get lots of unpleasant experiences. Salesforce does help us with this in the actions and related records. And just a quick note on the term actions. That can just mean like sending an email. Maybe there's some kind of API call that needs to be made. Assigning a task, things like that. There could be other things other than just updating records. Assigning a task is actually an update technically, but there are other types of actions that we could do in the after side. Keep all those actions there. On the before side, yes, we could technically call updates to other objects here. Be very careful what you do with that. Really try to reserve this for the fast field updates. I think that's all we got on befores and afters. I know this can be a confusing topic, especially if you're moving from process builders and workflow rules into flows, but if you're coming from the world of Apex triggers or going the code route first, hopefully this makes a lot more sense, or if you're just trying to learn triggers, hopefully you can see where to use those befores and afters in your event management.